Bonjour à tous et à toutes.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being with us. I am Simone Tétu. I am Simone Tétu, and I'm a member of the Intersectorial Student Committee for the Research Fund in Quebec, so the organizers of the panel you will be hearing very soon. I will take a few seconds to present us briefly. I'll take this opportunity. This is a team of about 15 members in research and inter-university, intersectorial, of course, that represents all the future generation in research from collegial to postdoc. We have a mandate of advice with the researchers of Quebec and the board of directors of the Council of Research. We identify strategies to increase accessibility of the financing of research, to increase the potential for research and improve its relevance in society. The panel we prepared for you today will be about the different ways that the university community can encourage the next generation for research to be involved in science policy. We have Madison Willing as moderator, who's a former member of our organization. She has a PhD in physics at the Laval University, and she's general director of the organization in favor of photonic in Quebec. She's also a member of the Youth Council. Dr. Mona Nemer, and thank you to Madison and the panelists to have accepted this invitation. And before it starts, I'll just mention two reports of the organizers of the CPSC. Don't forget to CSPC. Don't forget to tweet using the @science policy or CSPC 2022. And don't forget to fill out the assessment form at the end of the session. Your comments are important for the organizers to improve next year's conference. I hope you enjoyed this panel. Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
An honor to host this panel. I really like when we speak about the next gen, impliquer la relève dans les politiques scientifiques. I was told that there are different translation tools that are available in limited capacity, but if you're here, it will be mainly in French. But please go see some of the organizers. I'm pointing to the person in green here in front, Alessandra, but also you can go to the registration desk for more information about that. Donc je vais poursuivre. La plupart
So I'll continue mostly in French today.
That we're going to have a lot of questions to the panelists, but if you have questions, please feel free to ask them in the language in which you're most comfortable.
So I'll take the chance to underline the work of the Intersectorial Student Committee. So that's the next generation getting involved through the Research Center. In the Canadian science policy, the committee works very hard, and I really want to underline that you should take the opportunity to talk to them while you're here at CSPC. So today we're talking of how the university community can encourage young researchers to become involved in science policy. So we have a great panel here. So these are people who are experienced in the university sector at different levels. We have researchers, but also the youngest generation who sees things under a different light. But the question is also, if one thing we've been hearing for a while is the elaboration of scientific policies based on the latest data, critical data. If we want to inform scientific policies, we have to bring together the university sector, the research sector, with decision makers who write up these policies. And we could argue that the next generation has a critical role to play there. So the scientific next generation, this driving engine of knowledge, is really critical at that level. But we were talking of our organization that's involved through the Research Fund of Quebec, but what can we do within universities in the research groups? So it's really around that we will be focusing our discussion today. So I have a pleasure of having with us Pauline Pic. I'll read in the language that was given to me, because I don't want to make any mistakes.
In the Canada Research Chair in International Political Economy. J'introduis aussi Jérôme Marty.
We have Jérôme Marty, who was Executive Director of the International Research Association on the Great Lakes and works with the Conseils Académies Canadiennes as well. Thank you for being with us. And Amélie Camel-Vallée.
Excusez-moi, epidemiology, biostatistics, and occupational health and Department of Sociology at McGill University. Et enfin,
and lastly, Simone Tétu, member of the Intersectorial Committee and also student at the back in Math and Physics at the McGill University. So we'll start going around the table, and I'd like to start with Pauline. Maybe you can take a couple of minutes to talk about yourself, your role, and also tell us what brought you to get involved in the elaboration of scientific policies. Well, thank you very much. I am a postdoc at the Laval University. I was working on the Arctic during my PhD research, and now I work on governance of the Arctic, deep space in the project of my PhD. And first time I got interested in the link between science and policy and to see how science can better inform policy is when I was invited to a government consultation, and I took part with several of my colleagues to this consultation. I went there very enthusiastic and very ignorant also, and I got to this consultation. I had prepared this as we prepare a university exercise. And actually the observation I made coming out of this consultation was that I had missed my target, because I had the impression that we weren't really speaking the same language with the political decision makers I met, and we didn't understand each other because I came with very specific knowledge and I'd prepared way too much compared to what was expected. And second impression I had was that I felt that the interview was organized so that the person have elements of language because they were going to a radio interview. But all that to say that essentially when I came out, I felt that I hadn't really informed political decision making. Maybe my objective was too ambitious when I went to that meeting, but it's at that point that I asked myself, how, as a scientist and researcher, could I try and improve the way that I communicate with policymakers, and how can science communicate better with politics? And right now my thought process is at several levels. First of all, at the research level, because I work on governance where the question of language and communication between science and policy is essential, because right now these are spaces that are being regulated, and we have a diplomatic language for the negotiation of treaties and the protection of those spaces, and that language is different from the very technical language of scientists that enable the exploitation of those areas. So that's the first question I have in my research. At a slightly more general level and maybe more personal, question of communication between science and politics, I asked myself that because news means we had to, with COVID crisis that showed that policies and science were not speaking the same language, didn't share the same calendar. And that was an issue also because I worked on the Arctic, and with the Ukraine crisis, many projects that involved Russian researchers were nixed. And right now we don't know when those projects will resume. And we realized that science is very political, and how can we compensate that? And lastly, I also asked myself of the discussion between science and policy at a career level, because I'm a young researcher. I'd like to have a position one day. We heard earlier that 80% of young researchers will not find a position in their academic level, which is very encouraging. And I'm also looking to get a profile that be competitive on that market, and I'm wondering how is it relevant and how much will it be valued for my profile to take time to try and communicate science and to dialogue about those policies. And I'll stop there. Thank you, Pauline. Jérôme, do you want to introduce yourself? Thank you, and it's a pleasure to have a French session today. I also have a session where the average age of the audience has gone down greatly, so it's a pleasure to share that with you today. I am Jérôme Marty. I came about 27 years in Canada to do my graduate studies at UQAM and University of Montreal in aquatic science. And when we work on water, it's a topic that is good to talk to the public with and to think about maybe a more higher up level than the effect we can find through our research. So I was a researcher in NGOs, an institute on the St. Lawrence in Cornwall. Then I worked in the private sector, WSP Canada, that really welcomed a scientist. There were only 5 PhD people in the whole organization in 2012 when I arrived, so it was something very new. And that probably brought along a lot of changes in the organization of that company. I worked a little as scientific advisor with fisheries and oceans before I came to the Conseil des Académies Canadiennes, which is a small organization in Ottawa that is specialized in the translation of scientific documents for the decision-making, and that produces this report that is made public and answer critical national or provincial issues. And to finish this introduction, I'd like to say that what brought me in this very diverse background, I teach at the University of Ottawa, and I often say I was a chameleon in my background. I adopted all sorts of colors, so you have to learn to adapt. That's the meaning of this. And one of the things that forced this trajectory was my family. Because when I did my graduate studies, we were both students, and we decided to have children very young. And that just flips the script around in the priorities. It was the first of us who would get a job. The second one would follow and find a way to get a job. And it worked. We were very lucky. But it's something that I also want to insist on the fact that we also have our personal life, and that you have to know how to balance both. And it's possible. Thank you very much, Jérôme. So we're engaging in the discussion on how to be a chameleon in the world of science policy. Over to you, Émilie. So I'm Émilie Cannavalet. I'm a professor in McGill. I have a joint position in sociology, epidemiology. It's a bit unusual to have a joint position in the arts and medicine faculty in life sciences, but it's because I work in sciences of populations, in public health, and I worked on the impact of political and social policies on inequalities in healthcare, because yes, the healthcare system can contribute to inequalities. Now we're recognizing that a bit more, but when I started 15 years ago here in Canada, it wasn't really something that was considered as very relevant as a research question. And so when I started, I had an academic perspective. I came from sociology. We were looking at that with a very critical, in a critical way, the fact of being involved in policies. The idea was you have to do fundamental research, and the best research will end up somehow in decision-making, potentially one day. However, I was working in the private sector in healthcare, and if you remember 2005-2006, for those of you who were following the news then, in 2006, we had the Kashaoli in Canada and the Supreme Court that had a bearing on the private sector in Quebec in healthcare. And so, in spite of me, I found myself at the National Assembly presenting at the National Assembly, and that was a striking experience that brought to me the importance of preparing information for decision makers and also working on the next generation of researchers. So through that, I had very interesting experiences later with colleagues in the context of partnerships with the with SHIRK and through Science of Population. And we're very much aware of those 80% that Pauline was mentioning, and I'm very much motivated by that, and to acknowledge the fact that it's not necessarily and only through university that you can support decision making, but in all sectors of society, and everybody wins from this if we can facilitate this transfer. And also to consider, to answer Jérôme's point, we have to consider that it's not a straight trajectory. There can be meandering, and that increases the decision making on both sides. And for a few years now, I'd say that I have a partnership also financed by SHIRK and training to support researchers in public health to better support public decision making. We have 15 universities in Canada with partners in the US and UK, Germany as well, and 21 partners that are out of academia, governments, NGOs, and agencies. And there is such an appetite. It's such a pleasure to work together to develop networks between the fellows and also between partners. So I think that that's something that really motivates me, and those are interesting leads to follow for the future. Thank you very much, Emily. We can see that with half the panelists, we have a great diversity of experience to go in our discussion. Simone? So it won't be very long to present my experience and my background, but when it comes to student involvement in policies that are linked to science and research, that's an interest that came to me when I was a student in the Cégep. When you're a student in Cégep and the world of research is a world you discover. And that's a world that you find sometimes a bit intimidating and certainly very different from what you know. It's got its own codes, norms, and vision of what is excellence. And when you're young and you approach this new world, you have a new point of view. You always wonder how it could be. And I think that's the spirit of the Student Intersectoral Committee and the Research Fund in Quebec. It's to bring this perspective of the new generation in the policies that will then influence. It can be different grant programs or funding programs. It will influence the Quebec research ecosystem. And some issues that this organization has focused on since its creation is the situation of postdoc students, students in the groupments of research, funded the professional insertion out of the university that we talked a lot about today. We can look into eco-responsible practices that affect the next generation, and psychological health. That's a new issue on which we need to focus. So within the research funds in Quebec, the student way has been there for a long time. I'd say that it's quite it's an organization that's pretty avant-garde, because even before the creation of the intersectorial committee, students were sitting on the board of directors. There was one per board of directors of the 3 funds of research in Quebec. So it's been quite a few years already, and I think that in the strategic orientations of the research funds in Quebec, we can feel this concern for students in the organization, in the way they adapt the programs to the new visions that the committee submits. And I think that's pretty much it. Thank you very much, Simone. And I have the pleasure of welcoming Pierre-André Bouchard-Saint-Amand, who is a professor of public finance. I'll just ask you to introduce yourself and then tell us, Pierre-André, what brought you to be involved in science policy. So hello, I'm a professor in public finance. I was late today, sorry about that. Also director of the research group in public applied public economy. If you're interested, that's the theory of the economic theory of how the state should intervene in public policy and on the economy. And I work with several agencies and organizations in the government. I worked with ESDC, Environment Canada, Revenue Quebec. Recently, I have conversations with the taxpayers ombudsman. So very much hands-on in the analysis and the thought process about ongoing public policies or future public policies. And the main motivation is this desire of change. I think very much about university as a place of action where we can orient or change the state of the world and to try and have an influence on the public apparatus through policy. So how can we come into this dynamics as academia with our values, but also an idea that we're there to try and do better and be involved in that effort. And maybe to set the table for the people thinking about this, I'd say there's a bit of a gap between the pure academia, pure research, and research that aims to be applied. And I'm sure we will have the chance to discuss these ideas. But the idea of working in groups versus working alone, the idea of working on fundamental ideas, relative, with a lot of time, relatively, or working fast on complex issues in a team, sometimes working with imposed values versus your own values, because sometimes when we work with the public apparatus, we're confronted to some considerations that are a bit gray area in the scientific field. For example, tax policies, fiscal policies, if we have government favoring the redistribution of wealth, we won't necessarily have the same analysis as one that favors economic efficiency. So how, as a researcher, can we position ourselves in this conversation through values and all that? So those are reflections to have if we want to be interested in that and to be hands-on. But I'm sure we'll mention that again. Yes, that's a great introduction, and as you say, it sets the table for this question, that is the dialogue between science and policy. We could say it's an art, it's an expertise that is developed. And Pierre-André, you started talking about working methods and skills in that field. So the question I would like to ask the panelists is, what should the next generation know to be able to contribute to this dialogue in a significant way? And I'd like to start with Amélie. Well, I'd say that beyond the questions as to where we position ourselves on the political spectrum, it's also important to know that the deadlines are not aligned between research and decision-making, and that's moving at different speeds on both sides. And sometimes it's in university that we can move faster, especially if we don't need a lot of resources in the dry labs. I need to have access to data, and I decide, and it can leave next year. On the other hand, when we work with decision makers, there's often a process. We have to go up in the decision-making process. Sometimes we can have the impression when you're a student, and it can be a problem, because when you bring students on a project, it's possible that the project can take longer than what you'd want for the student's graduation. So you have to know how to navigate that also. And sometimes we have to go up in the decision-making process, and that can take longer for decision makers. But on the other hand, when it's time to move, it was yesterday. Whereas on our side, especially when there's a budget coming up and we need to push the policy briefs and the policy options out. Whereas on the university side, that's the time when we'll slow down a bit and we'll say, yes, but on the one hand there's this, on the other there's that, but what is the recommendation? Well, we should take into account the analysis, the opportunities, the threats and weaknesses, and I think that's where we need to develop trust with the partners we're working with so that we can deliver, and we can do it in the timelines that are given, and to speak and to communicate those needs. So that comes with experience, and that's where, and I anticipate on the research directors can help to make that more explicit to students and young researchers with whom they work. Otherwise, it could be potentially a bit frustrating, or we can have the impression that you won't feel listened to, as Pauline was saying, the impression that we're not speaking the same language or not living in the same reality.
J'aimerais poursuivre avec Pierre-André.
We'll carry on with Pierre-André. He has a microphone in hand already. So, what do we need to know? Well, I'd say that we need to be able to work on science policy in the broadest sense. I'm thinking of government-wide. That's something that is developed as a team, and it means that many ideas have to be incorporated into the mix. There are certain ideas, of course, that are dear to some people that may not be find their way in the final product. So we have to work on very crucial issues, but some of those ideas might not make it in the final mix, and that can have an emotional impact on certain researchers. But you have to know how to work as a team. But when in the university setting, of course, you can be working on your own on protocols or methodologies for 6 months at a time without interference. And I would have had a tendency to say that the public policy cycle is a lot quicker than that of a university. Oh, okay, so we are saying the same thing. Fine. So, yes, in the political circles, things move about very quickly. For example, we settled a minimum wage debate in about 3 hours. So we just take what we have, we make it fit, we find the best fit, and then we communicate that information and because that was a crucial issue that was being debated, and the government had to have an answer. So in academic circles, we made a recommendation within 3 hours. So we have to be able to pivot very quickly, and so sometimes it's so that we can interact very quickly with the government, or sometimes it's maybe not in 3 hours, but within a span of 3 weeks, come up with an answer that can be used for the purpose of decision-making at a political level. So things can move very quickly, and you have to be accustomed to that rhythm, and you have to accept the idea that the answer may not be perfect, but we have that reflex. Well, we'll pick an answer, and we want to make sure that we can apply our methodology and cross all the T's and dot all the I's. But because of the constraints, by the very nature of the problem that's at issue, we formulate the best answer possible under the circumstances, accepting the fact that it's not necessarily perfect. There are some limitations. And of course, there's also the question of values. The position that I have, because I work at the National Public Administration School, so we train future civil servants. So if ever the next, next week there was a completely different government from the one that we have, or we had to serve a government with a very different ideology or a very different outlook, how do we serve that government well? So as civil servants, of course, this is a fundamental question that you have to ask yourself. And we need to be able to approach certain subjects with detachment, even if you have invested a lot of emotional capital in a particular issue and you've been working on it for years. So, and you have to ask yourself, are we ready to work on this issue with the government, or should we pass it on to somebody else who's better suited? Or so I don't want to hog the microphone here, but these are the kinds of questions that we have to ask ourselves. The mindset of the government is important to take into consideration, and when you enter into this kind of conversation. Thank you very much, Pierre-André. Amélie had alluded to the fact that research directors can monitor that kind of involvement. So so I'm now going to give the microphone over to Pauline, who has a more recent experience with involvement. So what do you think the next generation of researchers has to know to be efficient or effective? Very good question. I'm not going to come back on the question of the difference of pace between the decision-making at the political level and the research agenda. But I think an important question that we ask of politicians and that we're not necessarily aware of is that a science policy is a policy. And so science is going to be a part of the input needed for the decision-making, but it's not going to be the only factor taken into account by the politicians. So, and I've discussed this with many of my colleagues, and many of them have told me, yes, but I took part in a consultation, and in the end, the decision was very different from what I'd recommended. And so I think it's important to remember that a science policy is a policy, and it's not because our report wasn't followed that it wasn't heard, but it may have been interpreted differently. And the second important element, in my opinion, is that policy and decision-making is taken at many different levels. And so it can be very intimidating for a young researcher to have to deal with the higher levels of government. But political decision-making is sometimes done at the municipal level or the local level. And that can also be interesting as a process. So students who are working on a local problem, for example, can reach out to local politicians. And that's important because it's a way of building your experience and confidence, and it's less intimidating afterwards to meet with higher level government officials. Thank you, Pauline. Jérôme. Pauline just actually took the words right out of my mouth. So the experience that I've had working with various organizations, local organizations and national organizations, and the government of federal government being one of them, I realized that the most of the decisions that need to be taken in our society don't need to involve the higher levels of government, whether it be the provincial or federal government. The majority of the decisions that we need to make are taken within organizations at lower levels, within even research groups in the academic world. So if you're a student and you want to contribute to the discussion and the decision-making process, it's probably a very good idea to start at lower levels of decision-making. And why do I say this? Well, when you're a graduate student and you're very proud of your diploma, of course, and you have a lot of energy and time, we are specialists in whatever field that we've studied. But the capacity to make a decision at that point is maybe very close to our expertise, but that's not the case when you contribute to decision-making at a higher level, because those decisions are really the result of integration of knowledge and all kinds of problematics that are much more diversified and much more complex than what you're used to dealing with as a researcher. And we're talking about expectations as well. I think that as graduate students, you'll have a lot more success, or at least you'll feel a lot better about contributing to a lower level of decision-making instead of tackling higher levels of government in the hope of being heard. Thank you. And Simone, you've just joined the Student Intersectoral Committee. So what is required to be better involved? What are the skills you need to develop to be better involved? Well, as a student, there are a lot of things we don't know yet, and I understand that there are challenges that we want to get involved in decision making at higher levels. But if I think of the committee, it's important to gather a team, for example, of researchers, young researchers within various fields, and that's what we have as a membership of the committee. And it's an advantage. There are issues on which students are perhaps specialists, for example, student issues, and so that's the kind of thing that we tackle. There are certain things that we do know well, and I think it's important to have confidence in what we do know and in our ability to contribute. It can motivate some people among young researchers to get involved in policy decisions. And the other thing I'd like to mention is that as somebody who's really at the beginning, because I started with the FRQ a couple of years ago, one of the things I would have liked to have known back then is I would have liked to more aware that the people around me are not necessarily going to understand what I do. When I tell them that I work at the Quebec Research Fund, the first question I get is, well, what is FRQ? And then I talk about the Student Intersectoral Committee. Nobody understands or even remembers the name. So as students, we often have to sell ourselves to get bursaries, to get scholarships, and to convince people to work with us. And so scientific explanations have a lot of value, but they're not necessarily understood, even within academia. And it's normal. There are a lot of people that have an excellent academic career that never get involved in the political sphere. And I think for students to have the confidence of speaking about what we do, why it's important, and that means that we develop skills that have a lot of value and that can even help in a purely academic career. And so those are the kinds of things I would have liked to have known a couple of years ago. Thank you very much, Simon. So at CSPC, I've been meeting a lot of young researchers that are just dying to get involved in science policy and development. And we use the term dialogue a lot, because that's the way, of course, we build bridges. So my question to you is, in tangible terms, what are the tools, the means that can be used to open communication channels, not just within the research environment, but between the new researchers and decision-making instances, either at the political or social level? And I'll start with you, Pauline. Yes. Well, I think that there are a couple of tools that could be interesting to mention. For example, I'm in political science, so it's part of my training, but I think that's a skill that you could generalize for anybody who's interested to fill in the blanks when you give a scientific explanation, because it's important to be able to speak the language of politicians so that it can be understood. That's very important. And it's not limited to political sciences or social sciences. It's a skill that we should find in all backgrounds, proponents of all backgrounds. And then there's another skill. Just yesterday, I received an email that was talking to me about a new project. It's the first time I've heard of this project. It's a postdoctorate work where there's a one-year residency program within a government office. So how valuable is that going to be for a future academic career? I'm not sure. But I think I've never heard of this elsewhere. But I think it could be interesting because as a student and a person who's going to, if we want to decide if we're going to pursue an academic career or another career, that is a kind of a hybrid experience that opens one's horizons. Thank you, Pauline. And I'm now going to give it over to Jérôme. Well, I'm going to continue to insist on the importance of multidisciplinarity and the importance of getting skills outside of your field of expertise, and take risks as well, and dive into outside of your comfort zone, because I think that's what's going to open up your way of thinking, and to be able to participate in the thinking in other fields. And it's also very satisfying if you choose to go that route. Knowledge transposition or knowledge transfer is very important. There's a lot of publication every year, but it's important for the government, of course, to make the right decision that's going to be accepted by the greatest number of people. And so it's important to get experience outside of your field because you need to be able to develop skills in terms of knowledge transfer so that you can get the message across. And also written information is very important. The programs that we see nowadays allow you to. There weren't the possibilities of getting experience in the political arena. MyTAC offers that kind of opportunity now. And there are other areas in research areas where there are openings of the same kind. And I'm going to stop right there. All right. We'll have other issues to delve into, but I'm going to ask Simone. What would you were saying? What would you have liked to have known a couple of years ago? So, what are the tools or the things that you would have liked to have possessed back then to help you? Well, I totally agree with what's been mentioned so far, and of course, for new researchers, explicit information is really important, but also the distribution of information. Dissemination of information is really important, and all of the resources that are made available to the new researchers is not, if it's not known, is not useful. So it's important to talk about science policy, with the new next generation of researchers, and talking about communication channels. The members of new researchers are used to learning. We're constantly learning, and we learn from each other as well. So I think that when we involve new researchers in the science policy development, I mentioned that I started getting involved in policy development in CEGEP. And of course, I was in contact with graduate students, and this really opened up my mind. So it's important to gather people, disseminate the information, and make sure that all of the resources that are available and accessible, and that the intended audience is aware of them. So we talk about multidisciplinarity and support teams. Pierre-André, well, I'm going to talk about a student who would like to develop these skills. So I have three ideas. First of all, integrate a team where applied research is done in cooperation with a political perspective. And two examples right now. We're looking with the Higher Learning Department of Quebec how universities are being financed. But we have people among the group that are doing simulations. So we have researchers and assistants that are working directly with civil servants to gather the data and refine their models. And so this is an experience that is very enlightening for them and for the department of the ministry as well, and will lead to better policies. And generally, there are work placements as a result. Another example, with Environment Canada, we're looking at flooding prevention measures. So in 2012, 2013, of course, there were a series of floods, and we started looking, and we were responsible for the economic analysis of the models. And so we have people who worked on those policies, looking at it from an environmental perspective, that also ended up with a certain expertise in And a second idea, get used to answering questions that are not directly related to your field of work. Listen to the news, keep abreast of the new, and at night, ask yourself, how would you answer this question? It's a difficult exercise, of course, because very often, of course, there are very varied topics in the daily news, but the exercise will allow you to develop reflexes that will allow you to answer questions in areas where you don't necessarily have the same level of expertise. So you have skills that you can definitely apply to, and also, I'll never forget that there is also a specialist or an expert in that particular field. But that is an exercise that is useful. And the last point is to work on the communication side of things. Be ready to explain your ideas without using specialized language. This will allow you to get your message across when you're speaking to non-initiates. And I could talk about economics here, but nobody will understand what I'm saying. It's just too specialized when we talk about economic theory. But if I can use economic theories to answer questions, and you can be the brightest researcher, but nobody will understand you if you don't know how to bring it down to your audience's level. Yes, I was advised. I was told to listen to Power and Politics on a regular basis to learn how to answer questions like that, because it's important to know how to answer questions outside of one's realm of expertise. So it is a good practice. Amélie. Yes, I think that I'm going to piggyback on Pierre-André's recommendation. So how do we find researchers that are working in a more applied context and involved in decision-making? If you are students in Quebec, look at the FRQ concerted actions and the announcements that are made concerning these concerted actions. So these are initiatives that are made by decision makers that are looking for scientific answers, and FRQ then acts as a hub and supports the needed research. And now I'm talking about, of course, from experience, because I carried out a targeted concerted action with the Ministry of Health and Social Services, and also Employment and Social Development, and the Finance Ministry. So the three partners of the FRQ, they wanted answers as to what the best public policies would be the easiest to implement when it comes to redistribution of wealth in Quebec. And of course, that's a very broad question, as you can imagine. So we had a team of 11 researchers that delved into the topic, and we wanted to have young researchers involved. And so coming from Quebec universities for the most part, and of course there were other more senior researchers, but as so that we could provide mentorship opportunities for young researchers and postgraduate students and young researchers. We wanted to provide mentorship and foster rich exchanges. So during the 2 years of the subsidized work, we were accompanied, but always, so the research would be done with the interaction of the committee and the members of all the various ministries, education, family, and a few others that I forget, because of course it was a very broad issue. So, and I tell you this because when you have a subsidy, of course, it's always a pleasure, but now you have to get down and do the work. So, and we need to hire assistants, research assistants, and very quickly, because we need to pivot quickly, and it never can be done as quickly as decision makers would like us. But so be aware of these opportunities when they arise, and don't hesitate to write to professors, do cold calls, send your resume, and explain in a quick paragraph why you should be the one chosen. And I very often get requests that are a good fit, and so this is a very pertinent avenue for Quebec students, but maybe some other at the table have other ideas for the rest of Canada. And of course, the Tri-Council Fund Research, they all have training platforms and work in partnership, and their connections with the governments don't necessarily have connections with the government, but many. We talk about the political arena here, but decision-making is done everywhere, and it has to be based on evidence. And so we work on big data. Big data is an area that is highly in demand, and governments right now have, and nonprofit organizations have a lot of data, but they have a lot of problems integrating it all. So we can be useful in that. And so what we do in that in our group, which involves McGill University. So we have a governance model, and we involve them in our governance model to familiarize researchers and get them used to communicating with various audiences and working in an interdisciplinary environment. And now some of them will eventually go to government positions. And yeah, because very often there are work placement opportunities at the end of these projects, and that certainly has happened over the last few years. So there's an enormous appetite for our skills. Thank you. Pierre-André? Well, I just wanted to, over the last few weeks, we've hired 5 people. 3 of them had just sent us their resume, and they weren't even aware that there was an opening. So, in effect, it is a good strategy to get in contact with a professor. A professor may not know that you exist, but when he receives a resume along with a message, then at least you're on the radar. So, for the members of the audience, I think the organizers of the panel chose wisely, and we have on the panel people who are very much involved in policy development and professors with actual experience. So we are here at the CPSC with a lot of people who are getting involved. But let's say student researchers are mentored and supervised by their own research director, and perhaps these people are not necessarily aware of the importance of the dialogue with the political side of things, and don't necessarily encourage the young researchers to get involved in the dialogue that we're talking about today. So I will talk. So how do we fill that gap? So that research directors or supervisors will encourage the students to get broaden their horizons. Well, I think it's important to lead by example. And in criminology, of course, in sociology, we are used to working as teams. It's more the norm, and we usually tackle some more tangible problems. We look at the trajectory of a health system, for example. But in the arts faculty, the question is how to bring people into teams like the concerted teams, concerted action teams on redistribution of wealth, for example, and see how we can enrich their experience and that of the students. And it's the same thing with the RNP3. We have students in population health. A lot of them don't have any experience with interactions with non-clinical experts. And there are students that are doing practicums and that establish connections. So I really believe in the importance of networks. And it shouldn't be constrained. It has to happen more or less naturally. That's the way it was for me. And I saw and appreciated the importance of developing interpersonal relations with people working in government, for example. And that's how I developed confidence and that new opportunities arose for me. So it's important to share your experience with people who have the skills that you need so that you can benefit from their support. And so because we need for everybody to be at the table to answer these questions. So from that point of view, I become more of a researcher, entrepreneur, if you wish, in certain respects. And as a generalist, of course, I can synthesize all these various experiences. And when we're asked to, okay, so we have a budget request, can you help us suggest some policies? So then I will ask my colleagues to say, my colleagues will say, well, it's more complicated than that. But I think it's important to make them understand that they have to come up with something at that moment. I'm the one who's going to sign. I'm the one who's going to take it upon myself, and ask everybody to come up with their best solution. And so, but that's the way we build bridges. Thank you. And I'll ask Pauline as well, who was supervised by research director, and by the nature of your research, you were encouraged to be more proactive, and you may become a research director yourself at some point, so, or research supervisor. So how do we feed that kind of involvement?
Il se trouve que moi, mon directeur de recherche, en fait.
Well, it so happens that my research director wasn't too interested in, well, he was interested for our research project, obviously, but it wasn't one of his priorities, let's say. And I would say that if ever, well, maybe at our level of young researchers, we can still go get other projects alongside. We can get involved in other projects alongside our research, and that happened like that for me. I was involved on other projects, and actually it meant that there was one project where my director had to be with me because I was considered as a young researcher, so I couldn't go alone, and he also accompanied me on this project, and it was very interesting. And I think it ended up bearing fruit. And it's interesting to remember that when you're doing a PhD, you can do other things alongside your research project, get expertise elsewhere, and see potentially in other disciplines, but also in other research projects how it works. Because it could be an interesting gateway for us that enables us, if our research doesn't bring us that aspect, we can go get it elsewhere. I would add from your example that mentorship can take two directions, and that's very important too. We can't believe that it comes from top to bottom, but also when we have to have an open mind to what the students are bringing. So it's two-way mentorship. You will have heard that. Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Pauline. I would ask Pierre-André also. I hear through your answers that I'm sure you support the future generation getting involved like that. Could you give advice to other colleagues who are maybe not aware in the same way of how they can better encourage and support the future generation in that sense? It's difficult to tell people who are not interested to be interested. Maybe to do a minimum of simplification of the of things, that could be a way that's fairly easy to do a first step in that direction in layman's terms. And the second way is to involve students in meetings where there's a kind of consultation of practice. So it will happen wherever you are in the spectrum of university research, that you will have to give some expert advice on a question through a public authority, through a corporation, through the news, maybe, media. And you have to somewhat integrate students in those answers. That can be a very interesting way, very good way, if only to see behind the scenes. I brought some first cycle students in public policy on Gérald Fillon's set to see how it works, the interview, how it happens, etc. on CBC. And you have to see that sometimes there's lives that are cut because an answer is given, so you see the behind the scenes, and we can see how the public relationship works with university. Bring students to Revenu Québec, so I transpose things, maybe you can do like that too. But essentially, you can try and integrate those students in the expert communication. So I'll establish a link with what Pauline was saying earlier. At the end of the day, what will be valued? So I did a PhD in physics, and my research wasn't going to go towards decision-making, but I could still get involved because I had some research directors who were valuing that or gave me the freedom to do so. Whether it's a personal choice or other, sometimes there can be another dimension without being the result of their own research, but just to be able to expose yourself through their research. Amélie? I think on the question of valorization, we can see that there are grants like Banting or Vanier that have explicit leadership components, and those are very relevant aspects to bring up in leadership files. So I think that the value is there clearly in our granting organization. Sometimes it takes a bit of convincing, let's say, for our directors to ensure them of the fact that it won't slow down progression too much, or it's a way of managing time a bit differently, but it will have a good impact. Okay, I want to invite the public, if you have any questions, to go to the mic. I'll be able to see you and give you the floor. In the meantime, I'll ask another question. I'll address it to Jérôme this time. What strategies do you recommend for a message to be well received from the decision-making bodies? So it's a simple question, but we also talk about the dialogue and how we will get that information. Well received by whom? That's the sub-question. So if I use the experience I've had, for me, a good decision, and other members of the panel underline that, it's really the importance of the quality of the data. And today it's true that we're in a society where there's a huge amount of information. There's the worst and there's the best, and you have to be able to make that distinction that in some fields becomes very difficult. We saw that during that period of COVID with all sorts of information, wrong information. And it's important to see that the quality of the information is good. It's also to recognize the limits of that data, of that knowledge, to not believe that you have the absolute answer. The decision will probably not be perfect. We've heard that on this panel already, and you have to acknowledge those limitations. The clarity with which we express a recommendation is critical also. And learning the language to be able to do so, to optimize our impact, is important. And last thing I'd like to say is that you have to be ready to establish a distinction between a recommendation and a key information, a key finding. And yes, politicians must make decisions based on recommendations, but sometimes it's probably best to not issue a recommendation and simply express one discovery and to leave the decision to higher echelons. And I'd say that in the organization where I work, the Council of Canadian Academia, we do those huge reports, and one of the key messages of our reports, we always ask, what do you recommend? We don't recommend anything. We bring the state of the knowledge on a leading topic. We express the experience that worked well. We express the things you shouldn't do, but we do not say to Environment Canada or Fisheries and Oceans or other departments to not do this or that. We leave them to decide what is the best decision. And that is something that's been very satisfactory for the research teams working with me and for the members of the panel, expert panels, who helped with those reports. Thank you, Jérôme. And I'll leave Pierre-André answer quickly before we move on to a question. A lot of wisdom in Jérôme's words. Wisdom with me is very rare, so good. You have to remember we're not the ones making the decision, and that's how we can be a bit removed from the issue. But still, it's sometimes not our role to be pleasant, and it can happen to speak to political decision makers to go against their assertions on the basis of scientific facts. And so there you need to brace yourself and do the work, because sometimes we represent science and they represent policy, and you have to confront them sometimes. It's part of our role at certain levels. So yes, if you want to decide that, do it, but don't do it on the basis of the link you're establishing now. That scientific link does not exist. Good luck. So this kind of conversation has to take place. You need to think about it yourself, but it can be part of the work when we're interacting with the policies. Thank you very much, Pierre-André. So there's a lot of expertise and experience around the table. So I'll leave the audience ask a few questions. I'm Etienne Lepage, Assistant Director in the Integration Team for Agriculture Canada. Essentially, in my work daily, I take information coming from our researchers at AAC to bring them in the pipeline of policies. And I was curious to know if there was a type of function that we found in some academic sectors, or if that's not something we could try to build with bridges between those shops we have in the government to integrate and the university sector, because that's something we heard in several of your presentations. The first time you had to do so, you were a bit lost, but there are some teams in some departments that help researchers do that. I think it'll be a question of discipline or sector. In the training partnership I talk about, our partners are located at the Chief Data Officer level, and I think that's probably linked with the directors, directions or units where you are. For example, at the Canadian Public Health Agency, there would be your counterpart, they're our partner. They work on the meta-analysis and the guidelines. And they work on recommendations. So I think that is something that's well known, but maybe sector-based. And it's probably worth exploiting. I strongly recommend it. Is there a panelist who would like to add something? Jérôme? I think there's an evolution that takes place, maybe particularly over the last 10 years in public service, with the creation of those groups within governments to establish those bridges. The fact that today we insist on decision-making based on fundamental data, it's a much stronger message than 10 years ago, without even mentioning what we did 15 years ago. And I think that there is that opportunity, and the fact of having in federal departments scientific leaders, that's something that's fairly new in some departments. But those are indeed structures that bring this expertise to the outside. And I'd simply conclude by saying that the decision-making today involves a lot of consultation, and that consultation is also a bridge for university organizations, the public, and even students, where they can take part. And in the environment sector right now, there's a lot of consultation about climate change, and everybody can contribute. And there's also a lot of submissions. Analysts behind those platforms are probably inundated, but those are links that exist. And when I was a student at master's level, we did a submission to the BAP, Bureau des Audiences Publiques in Quebec, and it was my first experience. And it's something that I kept in my CV, I believe. It's that kind of interaction that enable us to connect with people. Another comment, Emily? Well, yes, I would encourage you. You see the researchers who publish, contact them and introduce yourselves, ask them if there are any opportunities, start establishing bridges that way, because you have that outlook. And when it comes to researchers, I think it would be extremely good for them to know that you use their data in a recommendation or a report, because more and more at the university we're trying to recognize the value added. We're trying to consider the impact of research and the output beyond the impact factor. And this kind of evidence, often the problem is attribution. We put stuff out there, but we never know who's using it. Well, there's some metrics available, but there you could potentially help someone out to set up a promotion file with clear evidence as to the impact of their research. And that's how we start changing universities from the inside too, and to bring a promotion committee to consider that as valuable. Thank you very much, Emily. Question to the right. Yes, hello. I'd like to start by amplifying something that Dr. Riley said that seems to be absolutely true. It's the fact that to get involved in scientific policies, we don't need to be an expert, a specialized expert of the field in which we need expertise, because essentially the kind of expertise often beyond the critical data we need to think about a policy, to inform a policy, is an expertise from a thinker, researcher, someone who can deal with that data and who can think through those and communicate on those. So that's something that seems critical because it opens many doors. But my question is somewhat different. Clearly, when we think of the researchers that get involved in the policies, we think of the MITAC Science Fellowship, and often the government organization we're interested in is the federal government, sometimes provincial, but rarely municipal. And everything you said is very interesting, very true, but I'm wondering what advice or what recommendation would you make to someone who wants to encourage young researchers to get interested in scientific policies, but for municipal governments? Is there a difference? Is it the same thing? I'm very interested in that. Thank you very much for the question. Pauline or Pierre-André, do you want to take that one? Well, very briefly, I think it has a lot to do with the research project, even if it's true that we don't have to inform politicians on a field of expertise specifically. I feel that the field of research specifically will orient necessarily how we position ourselves. And so I feel that we'd have to aim independently of the research projects, because some directly apply locally. And for this type of project, it's wholly relevant for the local and municipal level to know if there could be any links established between that research project and the municipal level, But I'd say that for me, in the way I see things, you have to aim for the research projects that have this kind of local implementation, and it will allow people involved in that to inform the municipal level and get more involved. I think Emily wanted to react on the municipal level. I don't have a clear answer. First, I share your idea that the municipal level is forgotten in the conversation on the different levels of government. Maybe we can say to the municipal level to not hesitate to knock on doors of universities with a question. And then after that, to think, if we think more about the student side, to not hesitate to think about how a research question on which you're working can have a municipal effect. Climate change is discussed municipally, fiscality as well, urbanization as well. So how can you think of all those levels? And that's a lot of work that is happening between researchers and municipalities. We were working in deploying the 5G in Montreal. Our work was mass modeling work. So the quality that was looked for was more talent in programming as much as knowledge of the file per se. So it's essentially to understand how the telcos would behave and try and program that. And then I would add that these are generally questions where we have a multidisciplinary question, because these are organizations that think about the multidisciplinary aspect as well. And around that, I don't know, maybe we could have a broader reflection on this. For me, I think that the question of scale is important. We just had a testimony on the unit, research unit at the federal level. It varies according to the years, but when we talk of the municipal level, it happens in different ways. If we talk of Montreal, it's a population of a small province with the capacity of research and action that goes with it. And I think we should go to see organizations that gather several of those community organizations. For example, we work with the Chantier d'économie sociale in Quebec that's supporting other organizations too. And with that, they have the capacity of having our students, because we know it takes time also and capacity. So I'd say for those who are interested and whose research has municipal bearing, I think it's important to also go see where there are organizations that can represent that support. Thank you very much for the question. And a very last question before we close. Thank you, Patrick Montfort. I'm a researcher at the CNRS in France. It's a pleasure to attend to this conference. Everything that was said here, I agree with. And one of the questions I have is, maybe I'm wrong, but I believe the youngsters today have strong interest in the involvement of society and political and scientific policies. And I think the demand is there, and our promise to encourage them. So everything that was said, everything we can do is important. But the concern I have is, today are the youngsters who could enter that system and who could be very good scientists and take part in those political and science policies are not being lost. That's a question we have in France. I don't know if it's as important here, because when youngsters today feel so concerned about the environmental questions globally and they want to act, they wonder, are we really contributing something in going in academia or doing research? How does this action, how will this action change policies? And I think that's where we have an important role. And we also have a disaffection of science from young men as opposed to young women. We have a strong differential, and that can be a problem also to take into account in society the role that we may have. So those are two questions that you might not have an answer to right away, but that seem as important as the practice of encouraging that's strong. Jérôme? So indeed, the young generation probably has good reasons to say, I have the knowledge from university, but that's not going to enable me to have an impact on decision making. What I encourage to make sure that this young generation still has a pathway is to involve them at every level of decision making, including the higher levels. So when I hear Simone saying that students, even at the back level, have a seat at the table, that's critical, and we have to favor that. And the reality, now I'm getting close to 50 and I'll be in an older category, is that we're all there to learn, and I will never say that someone has more value than another. Yes, we might have spent longer doing some experiments in science, but the perspective that the young generation can bring in decision making is something that I don't have, and that the majority of people making those decisions don't have, and they would benefit from that vision. Thank you very much. Simone, can I give you the last word to close? Yes, thank you. My personal experience is not universal, but it teaches me that the next generation is very motivated to be involved on issues. The choices of topics for research are strongly influenced by social sensitivities, climate. There are fields of research that are fully transformed on that level. And so I don't have the impression that we're really losing the next generation there. I'd feel like saying that in some cases, unfortunately, it was mentioned earlier, there are some research directions that are missing some openness, and maybe that could be a bit dissuasive for some members of the next generation. But those are cases that are less and less frequent. And the issue is awareness raising there, as we mentioned. So at the intersectorial student committee, we get around 200 candidates, young students who are motivated to the point that they want to become members of our organization. And every year for me, it's a reminder that the motivation is there. So I'm not particularly concerned there. Thank you very much, Simone. I'd like to thank all our panelists for the sharing of your experience, your expertise. We keep saying that it's a dialogue between science and policy making that is a win-win. It establishes more links, and it involves all generations, and the young generation specifically. If you can do so, come discuss more with our panelists on how it can be done tangibly. So thank you very much for the sharing. I'd like to thank the Research Funds of Quebec, the Intersectorial Student Committee for their invite today, and I want to underline that the team of the Chief Scientists of Quebec, who is organizing workshops and contributing to the creation of that dialogue, or even the clash between the two, was through this panel highlighting a lot of the components of the workshop. So don't hesitate to go speak to them. Thank you very much. I know that lunch is coming up, so enjoy your lunch, and we'll see you later. Thank you.